Chapter 1431. Su Qing wrinkled her pretty nose and looked at Yi Liangqiu, who was standing at the entrance of the lounge. Then she hugged Su Shiqing's arm and said coquettishly, "I'll live with Sister Liangqiu from now on." Her voice became softer. "I already have a child anyway." Su Shiqing slapped her hand away. "Nonsense. Even if you don't get married, your sister Liangqiu will." Su Qing ran over and stood in front of Yi Liangqiu. She held her arm behind her back and said with a lovely expression, "Welcome back, Liangqiu." "Are you serious?" Yi Liangqiu looked at her and said, "Su Qing, aren't you curious about your parentage?" When she said that, Su Cheng's expression changed slightly. But she still smiled in a carefree manner and said, "I don't know. I've been looking for so long, but I haven't found them. I've long given up." She shrugged and said, "I think they've given up on me too." Her head drooped and she played with her fingers, looking a little dejected. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and said, "Maybe I can help you." Su Qing looked up and looked at Yi Liangqiu. She blinked and tried hard not to cry. She pursed her lips and said in a very soft voice, "Sister Liangqiu, do you want Daddy and Mommy to chase me away? You don't want to know about your parentage even if you can." Yi Liangqiu took a step forward and said, "Is glory and wealth really more important than your biological parents?" Su Cheng's eyes were filled with big teardrops. "No. It's not like that." She pursed her lips and said, "Sister Liangqiu, I love Daddy and Mommy. It's not like what you said. I won't fight with you for anything, really." Her performance was wonderful. However, Yi Liangqiu didn't believe a word of it. In the beginning, Su Qing had used such a delicate and pitiful posture to deceive Yi Sun, causing Yi Sun to be consigned to eternal damnation. Her heart was as hard as stone. Su Shiqing, on the other hand, was unwilling to let his backyard be on fire, so he tried to smooth things over. "Liangqiu, that's enough. She's still young. Let bygones be bygones." The implication in his words was very obvious. He knew the truth of Yi Sun's matter, and he also knew that it was Su Qing who directly killed his half-brother. However, this was a scandal for the Su family. No matter what, Su Shiqing would turn a big problem into a small one and a small one into nothing. Moreover, this was something that happened many years ago. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "Yes." Su Cheng's eyes were still watery as she bit her lips. "Sister Liangqiu, I know that you hate me. I promise that I won't disturb you, nor will I snatch anything from you." With that said, she ran to Su Shiqing's side and placed her head on his shoulder, acting like a little girl. Su Shiqing's heart melted as he patted her hand. "All right, Daddy knows." He looked at Yi Liangqiu and coughed gently. "All right, let's go home." At the car park, Su Qing made a fuss about getting in the same car as them. Su Shiqing looked at her. "Your sister Liangqiu is pregnant. You have your own car, right? Daddy, you're biased." Su Qing stomped her feet, but she didn't say anything else in the end. Yi Liangqiu watched as she opened her car door and got in. The car started quickly and she looked up at Su Shiqing. Her car. Was it modified? Yes. Qing often hangs out with a bunch of racers. Even her own car has been modified several times. Why would she care about speed? Su Shiqing shook his head. Safety is the most important thing. Yi Liangqiu gave a sound of acknowledgement and got into the car. Chapter 1432. Su Shiqing sat beside her, and the chauffeur was driving. Su Shiqing patted her hand and said with a faint voice, "You have to bear with Cheng's matter. All these years, your mother. You know, once you have feelings, it is hard to get rid of them. Yi Liangqiu nodded and suddenly asked, "Dad, what about you?" Su Shiqing was stunned for a moment, and then he smiled gently. It's not a big deal to raise one more person in the Su family. These words represented all his thoughts. Moreover, the one who died was Yi Sun, and the one named Wang Kaiyun also went crazy and died. Wasn't this the biggest punishment for the Yi family? It was enough. A man like Su Shiqing would be relatively more tolerant when he reached a certain level. Moreover, Su Cheng was now Mrs. Su's favorite, so he had to be careful. Yi Liangqiu nodded and said nothing. The car slowly drove into the Su family's mansion. When they passed the tree at the entrance, Yi Liangqiu asked the chauffeur to stop the car. The chauffeur hesitated. "Stop the car," Su Shiqing said, and the chauffeur stopped the car. The car stopped, and Yi Liangqiu opened the door and walked to the tree. She stroked the trunk for a long time before returning to the car. "What's wrong? You still don't want to let go of Anlin?" Su Shiqing smiled gently. "If you don't want to, then get him back." "No need." She looked down. "If you can't have him forever, then it's better not to have him. Dad knows that you came back this time mostly for that brat Qin Anlin, but don't you think I'm too violent?" Su Shiqing frowned slightly. She didn't answer because the chauffeur had stopped the car. At the entrance of the villa, Mrs. Su stood there. She had heard from Shiqing that he would bring their daughter Su back at night. How could she not be surprised? She didn't have any hope, but he said he would come back. There was a touch of warmth in Mrs. Su's eyes, and she was indescribably excited. The car door opened, and the one who came out was Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su was stunned, and her whole body froze. She looked at Su Shiqing, who had followed her out of the car. She grabbed his arm with a twisted expression. "Shiqing, how could this be? How could it be Yi Liangqiu? No one could be Yi Liangqiu." Su Shiqing held her fingers and said softly, "She is our Su. "No." Mrs. Su let go of his arm. "How could I?" She shook her head in disapproval. Su Shiqing pressed her shoulder. "I've done a DNA test." Mrs. Su looked at his serious eyes and felt a little dazed. She really couldn't accept that it was Yi Liangqiu, the bitch that she had once thought of as. She even suspected that Su Shiqing had ulterior motives towards Yi Liangqiu. However, she turned out to be He Shiqing's daughter. It was the Su that she had once held in the palm of her hand. The image of Su as a child surfaced in his mind. No matter how he looked at it, he couldn't see the current Su at all. Her Su was so cute. How could she be the cold Yi Liangqiu? "The child is waiting for you." Su Shiqing's eyes were filled with encouragement, and there was also a rare warmth. Mrs. Su hesitated for a long time before looking at Yi Liangqiu. Her feelings were extremely complicated. How many times had she woken up in her dreams because she missed her Su? Then, she hugged Qing all night, unable to sleep. However, now that Su was standing in front of her, she felt that it was unreal. Chapter 1433. Her lips moved, but she could not bring herself to be affectionate. She said calmly, "Let's go in then. Pregnant people should not stand for long." Yi Liangqiu squeezed out a smile. "Okay." The mother and daughter were polite but distant. This was a gap that could not be filled in 20 years. The few of them walked into the grand hall. To ease the atmosphere, Su Shiqing's tone had a touch of warmth. Su, do you still remember this place?" Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "We were afraid that you would come back when you grew up, so we did not dare to move. We have lived here for more than 20 years. The interior has been renovated several times, but we could not bear to get rid of the tree at the entrance." Su Shiqing sighed, feeling a little emotional. As he said that, he ordered the servants to start the meal. Because it was a day of reunion, the meal was sumptuous. Su Shiqing even specially tipped everyone in the house 10,000 yuan and solemnly introduced Yi Liangqiu's identity. His attitude made it clear to the servants in the house that Sir favored Miss Su more than Miss Su Qing. Mrs. Su saw this and did not say anything, but she was a little unhappy. She picked up a piece of braised pork with her chopsticks and gave it to Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu looked up. Mrs. Su's expression was a little embarrassed. Then, she said calmly, "Eat." Yi Liangqiu lowered her head and bit down, feeling a little upset. Mrs. Su was very distant with her, and of course, she was the same to them. She felt that she was cold by nature and it was difficult for her to like others, even her own parents. But even so, Mr. Su seemed to be very satisfied. He smiled and said, "Liangqiu, your mother is cold on the outside but warm on the inside. It will be better later." Su Qing held her chin and affectionately picked up a piece of tofu for Mrs. Su, coaxing her. "Mom is not. Mom loves me the most." Su Qing frowned and stuck out her tongue, looking very cute. The smile on Mrs. Su's face became normal and natural. "You are the best at coaxing people." As she spoke, she picked up a few pieces of meat and gave them to Su Qing. "These dishes are all your favorites. Mom had them specially made for you. Eat more. Look at you. You're as thin as a rib. What are you trying to lose weight for? Girls need some meat to look good." She said it naturally, and Su Qing smiled sweetly. Mr. Su looked at Yi Liangqiu and comforted her with his eyes. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. She just smiled. Why would she care? She couldn't even like Mrs. Su, so why would she mind Mrs. Su's love for Su Qing? Mrs. Su must have noticed something and put more food in Yi Liangqiu's bowl. Yi Liangqiu looked at the dishes in front of her, none of which she liked. Instead, it was what Su Qing liked. Some things, once missed, lost, can never come back. The same was true for family. After dinner, Mr. Su and Mrs. Su sat on the sofa and watched TV with her, probably to make up for the lost family. But no one's attention was on the TV, but on each other. Finally, it was 9 o'clock. There was no need for social activities anymore. Mrs. Su said with concern, "Su, sleep early." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and forced a smile. Mrs. Su personally took Yi Liangqiu to her bedroom, which was next to Su Chang's. It was also her childhood room, but it had been renovated and was very suitable for girls. Chapter 1434. In their hearts, she must be a little girl like Su Qing, right? Unfortunately, she wasn't. They must be very disappointed, right? Mrs. Su looked at her stroking a teddy bear and coughed softly. "If you don't like it very much, then I'll ask someone to put it away tomorrow." "I like it very much." Yi Qiuqiu turned her head and smiled slightly. "Maybe I'm pregnant with a girl. If I look at it every day, the child will be as cute as Su Qing in the future." Mrs. Su's expression was very unnatural. "As long as you're happy." After that, she left as if she was escaping. Yi Liangqiu looked in the direction of the door and smiled slightly. "Look, some things can't be forced." At this moment, there was another person at the door. It was Su Qing. She had already taken a shower and was wearing a pure white pajamas. Her long hair was draped over her shoulders, looking very sweet. Su Qing closed the door, leaned her back against the door, and looked at Yi Liangqiu. "What are you doing here?" Yi Liangqiu's tone was very indifferent, almost cold. But this didn't shake Su Qing at all. She walked slowly and smiled gently. "Sister Liangqiu, can you tell me why you returned to the Su family?" Yi Liangqiu's eyes fell on Su Cheng's face, and her fingers gently played with the toy in her hand. What do you think? Let me guess. Su Cheng slowly walked around her. To avenge Yi Sun. Or to drive me out of the Su family. She stopped walking. Or to get the ATV. Before Yi Liangqiu spoke, she smiled charmingly. Every one of them is very interesting. Her fingers gently touched Yi Liangqiu's heart. I'm looking forward to how Sister Liangqiu will deal with me. Really? Yi Liangqiu sneered. And then? Su Qing opened her arms and tilted her head up slightly. She looked at the light above her head and then turned to look at Yi Liangqiu. Do you know who prepared this room? I prepared it. Because I know that Dad doesn't believe me. In his heart, there's only his Su, so I can only do my best to make him feel that I'm his obedient daughter. I won't be a threat to his Su. That's the only way I can survive in this family. When Su Qing said this, she was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. That smile was not vivid, and it did not come from the heart. I'm already used to this kind of disguise. If I want to survive in this family, I have to cling on to someone. Sister Liangqiu, I've already hugged Mom tightly. What about you? You have to hug Dad properly. That way, we can be considered evenly matched. Su Qing smiled gently, somewhat provocatively. I don't need to cling on to anyone's thighs. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very cold. Su Qing sneered. Do you think it's because you're their biological daughter? Think about Qin Anlin, think about King Entertainment, think about the child in your belly. You'll know that you'll never fit in this family. Su Qing leaned over and whispered in her ear, Sister Liangqiu, this family isn't that easy to enter. You have to be careful, okay? Thank you for your kindness. Yi Liangqiu pushed her away. I'm going to take a shower. She walked into the bathroom, closed the door, and took off her clothes. Separated by a frosted glass, Su Qing stood and looked at the faint outline of a woman's body under the water. There was a hint of longing in her eyes. That was right in front of her, that was what she wanted. His fingers gently touched the glass, and he stroked it bit by bit. Chapter 1435. There was a hint of fanaticism in Su Cheng's eyes, but she quickly hid it. She was afraid that she would scare her. She was already feeling very happy now. When Yi Liangqiu came out of the bathroom after putting on her bathrobe, she was surprised to see Su Qing lying on her bed. She leaned against the door of the bathroom. Are you planning to take over my bed now? Su Qing patted the spot next to her and said happily, Sister Liangqiu, shouldn't we love each other? Besides, I want to hold the baby. You want to change the bedroom? Yi Liangqiu's voice was very cold. She didn't fall for Su Cheng's trick at all. Su Cheng sat up with the bedsheet wrapped around her and looked around. The bed is very big. I can tell stories to the baby. Yi Liangqiu didn't understand the fanaticism in her eyes. She felt that Su Cheng was a little weird. One moment, she had to deal with her, and the next moment, she was as intimate as a domestic husky. She looked at Su Cheng and smiled coldly. It sounds very friendly. Su Cheng smiled sweetly. Of course, I hope to coexist peacefully with Sister Liangqiu. After saying that, Yi Liangqiu came over and lifted the quilt. Su Cheng's pajamas were gone, and she was wearing a cute set of clothes. If I didn't know better, I would have thought that you were devoted to me. Yi Liangqiu dragged her out of the bed. Before closing the door, she said, I don't have that ability. The door slammed shut in front of Su Qing, hitting her nose. Su Qing touched her nose, tears rolling down her cheeks. What? You're so fierce. She didn't leave immediately, but looked at the door for a long time. Yi Liangqiu looked back and saw Su Cheng's pajamas on the bedside table. A strange feeling arose in her heart. Would Su Cheng be as crazy as Wang Kaiyun? But it didn't look like it. She pursed her lips and looked at the toys in the room. These toys were all prepared by Su Cheng. She lay flat on her back and reached for a toy. She pinched it and looked at the eyes of the little bunny. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. A pinhole camera. It seemed like Su Cheng had really taken her as an enemy. She was everywhere. She got up, picked up the toys, and carried them to the door of Su Cheng's room. He opened the door, stood at her door, and threw the few bunnies in front of her. In the future, don't play this kind of trick again. Su Cheng looked at her innocently. Sister Liangqiu, don't you like it? Do you want me to make it clear? She looked at Su Cheng. Is peeping your hobby or pleasure? Su Cheng pursed her lips. Sister Liangqiu, it's not like that. If there's a next time, you'll know the consequences. Yi Liangqiu turned to leave after saying that. Su Cheng looked at the few bunnies that had fallen to the ground. She pouted and said, "They're so cute." But no one cared about her. Yi Liangqiu went back to her bedroom. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She missed Anlin and Mu Yun. It was as if there were 3 monsters living in this house. Including her, there were 4 of them. In the same house, everyone had their own ulterior motives. She didn't know who the person hiding in the dark was. Her fingers gently stroked her lower abdomen, feeling the warmth that flowed through her. After a long time, she finally fell asleep. In her dreams, there were Anlin and Mu Yun. When she woke up in the middle of the night, the corners of her eyes were a little wet. There were tear stains. She told herself, Yi Liangqiu, you'll go back one day. Chapter 1436. In the master bedroom, Mr. and Mrs. Su lay side by side, not speaking. After a long time, Su Shiqing turned his head to look at his wife and said softly, "Our Su Su is back. In the future, your heart will be at ease. Also, don't be too biased. The child just came back, so it's hard not to be sensitive. You should treat Su Qing the same as her." Mrs. Su was clearly not in the right state of mind. After a long time, she said, "Of course I will." After a pause, she sighed. "Shiqing, I still feel like it's not real. It's probably because I've been away for too long. Now that I'm back, I'm not used to it." Su Shiqing laughed softly. "You're overthinking it. Liangqiu is not bad. She used to be a movie queen. Think about it, how many people can achieve that at her age?" Mrs. Su looked at him. "You still want her to act? What's wrong with that?" Su Shiqing asked casually. However, Mrs. Su turned serious and sat up straighter. "Thinking about it, it is quite a good thing. In the future, when Qing Qing manages the company, she will act in a few more blockbuster movies for the company. That way, ATV's future path will be much easier." Su Shiqing coughed lightly. "You think Qing Qing is better than Liangqiu?" "Of course." Mrs. Su did not hesitate. "Qing Qing is good at coaxing people. She's more slick. Su Su is clearly not good at socializing." Su Shiqing had a different view. "Do you think she would have achieved so much if she was not good at PR? Do you know how many actresses in King Entertainment are waiting to rise? Do you think she can do it just by relying on her acting skills?" Mrs. Su was silent. After a long time, she said, "You can't mistreat Su Qing just because she's back. Shiqing, you said you want to be fair. You can't mistreat our Qing Qing." Su Shiqing knew what Mrs. Su was thinking. His heart skipped a beat and he felt an indescribable feeling. Sometimes women were stupid. He had already said that Su Ching was slick, so why did she keep those coaxing words in her heart? She didn't care about her own daughter. Su Shiqing had always known that no matter how much Yi Liangqiu opposed him, he was still her father. She couldn't do anything to him, right? But Su Cheng was different. People who were not related by blood would never be related by blood. He also propped himself up and looked at Mrs. Su. How about this? As we agreed before, the shares in your hands will still be given to Su as dowry, and the shares in my hands will be used to test the two of them, to see who is suitable. Su Shiqing's words were a lie, but Mrs. Su took it seriously. She tilted her head. Shiqing, aren't you being too biased? Ching Cheng is also my daughter. But her surname was Yi. Su's surname is Su. Mr. Su's voice was a little harsh. Don't you know this? Think about it. After knowing the existence of Liangqiu, your mother's family probably won't agree to give it to Su Ching. Mrs. Su didn't say anything. She just looked at Mr. Su with a complicated expression. Su Shiqing's heart skipped a beat. He simply couldn't believe that Mrs. Su would do such a thing. You. He hesitated and didn't ask. Mrs. Su looked at him carefully. After a long time, she said, Shiqing, I've already given the 20% to Ching Ching. Su Shiqing's expression suddenly changed. He looked sharply at Mrs. Su, at the woman who had shared his bed for decades. Chapter 1437. Su Shiqing never thought that the person who made him more passive would be his wife. Because of this 20%, he had tolerated her countless mischief, as well as her love for Su Ching. But in the end, he was still tricked by her. Su Shiqing's heart was filled with sorrow, and Mrs. Su couldn't understand his sorrow. Lying down, he thought of Lady Qin, Hongku. He sighed in his heart. People can't be compared to each other. Mrs. Su lay down and looked at him carefully. Shiqing, are you angry? No. He asked calmly. Then what did you say to Su? Mrs. Su was silent for a long time. Shiqing, I have something to say to you. Su Shiqing laid down and looked at the ceiling above his head. He seemed especially calm. Mrs. Su propped up half of her body. Su grew up in the Yi family. You know that Yi Sun jumped off a building, Wang Kaiyun went crazy, and the whole family is weird. All these years, Su grew up in that kind of environment. How could she not change? Maybe. She looked at Su Shiqing's face and hesitated. How about we buy a villa for her to live alone, so that everyone can be more comfortable? Are you comfortable, or everyone is comfortable? Su Shiqing's voice sounded softly, and then he turned to look at Mrs. Su. You don't like her? His eyes were clear and slightly cold, which made Mrs. Su's heart tremble. At this time, she still hadn't realized her mistake, and said impatiently, We haven't seen each other for so many years, and she has developed this kind of character. I can't like her. Su Shiqing retracted his gaze, lay down straight, and then turned his back to her. Mrs. Su waited for a long time, but he didn't say anything, so she pushed him. She's my own flesh and blood. Even if I don't like her, I still have to like her. I have to tell her what I should tell her. Su Shiqing's tone was very calm. It's not her fault, we lost her. Mrs. Su looked at his cold back and sobbed. Shiqing, I know you blame me. All these years, you have always blamed me. Is that why you're looking for fairies? Are you hoping to have another child with the fairies outside? Su Shiqing didn't turn around to comfort her. He only said coldly, You think too much. Mrs. Su's tears fell like rain, and she couldn't sleep that night. She never knew that what Su Ching healed was her wound, not Shiqing's. For Su Shiqing, raising Su Qing was like raising a pet. It was just to make the owner happy, nothing else. However, it was completely different for Mrs. Su. She had already regarded Su Qing as her own flesh and blood. Now, she did not regret giving her shares to Su Qing. The next day, ATV President's office. Su Shiqing had a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't smoke it. He sat and looked at Yi Liangqiu across the desk. His tone was indifferent and slow. Your mother transferred 20% of her shares to Su Qing. He said it calmly, but his heart was not. Yi Liangqiu frowned and looked at him. When did this happen? 2 days ago. Su Shiqing turned his swivel chair and faced the floor-to-ceiling window. Stupid. Giving it to others just like that. If Su Qing was more ambitious, ATV wouldn't be surnamed Su. And Su Qing was originally surnamed Yi. Chapter 1438. It was naturally inconvenient for Su Shiqing to make an appearance. He looked at Yi Liangqiu for a long time before nodding his head. Don't let anyone know about this. She grunted in acknowledgement and walked out. When the door closed, Su Shiqing's eyes darkened. He didn't want her to do such an important thing, not to mention that it would hurt the relationship between mother and daughter. However, Su Shiqing had already made up his mind and made a choice. At Weibo Law Firm. While Lawyer Cheng was packing his things, his secretary, Linda, walked in. Linda closed the blinds for him and smiled sweetly. Lawyer Cheng, are you going home? Yes. Lawyer Cheng raised his hand and looked at his watch. We have an appointment for dinner at 8. Today was his daughter's 10th birthday, and he had already booked a high-class restaurant. He was successful in his career, and his age was the most attractive for a man. His wife came from a good background, which would be a great help to his career. Linda leaned against his desk and gently drew circles with her fingers. But it's still early. As she spoke, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his. Perhaps we can do something in this hour. Linda had a sweet face and a sexy body. Not many men could resist her. Lawyer Cheng looked at her red lips, and his throat couldn't help rolling. When it came to sex, his wife was as rigid as her family. For a man in his 30s, she really wasn't attractive. However, for a long time, he had restrained himself and suppressed himself. He didn't dare to have any romantic feelings. But at this moment, the fiery body in his arms completely ignited him. He lowered his head and kissed Linda's lips fiercely. His big palm also lifted her top. She was put down on the log desk, which made the man's whole body burn with fire, and he couldn't wait to vent it. The heavenly thunder touched the earth fire. Dry firewood and raging fire weren't enough to describe it. He stole glances on the desk, the carpet, and the sofa, telling his most primitive desire. As he was sweating, the door was opened. A few people walked in and took pictures of the man and woman who were entangled on the sofa. The flash hurt Lawyer Chang's eyes. He reached out to cover his face and shouted, "Who are you?" He was in a sorry state, and his elegance was swept away. Linda got up with a lazy expression, poked Lawyer Chang's chest, and licked her red lips. Your skills are a little bad. But a man who had been repressed for a long time was really like a beast. Lawyer Cheng narrowed his eyes and looked at the woman in front of him. Only then did he realize that he had fallen into her trap. You bitch. He gritted his teeth. I just work for money. Linda put on her clothes and glanced at Yi Liangqiu, who was standing at the door. As he passed by, he accepted a check for $10 million and kissed it. This was something she could never achieve even if she worked as an assistant for a lifetime. The man who was being held down said angrily, "This is a scam. This is kidnapping." Yi Liangqiu was standing, and the two ATV security guards were holding down the man who wasn't wearing anything. Whether it's a scam or a blackmail, if you're loyal to your wife, you won't succumb to a woman's seduction. She threw a piece of clothing on him. Put it on before we talk. Lawyer Ching hurriedly put on his clothes. His expression was very ugly. I know you. Yi Liangqiu, right? Chapter 1439. She waved the phone in her hand. What you should be more concerned about is that if the deal doesn't work out in half an hour, these photos will be sent to your wife. I think it's a small matter if my future is ruined. I heard that your wife's family has a background in the underworld. Will she lose an arm? Despicable. Shameless. Lawyer Ching pushed away the two security guards, sat down at his desk, lit a cigarette, and smoked fiercely. Tell me, what do you want? Yi Liangqiu sat opposite him and gestured for the two security guards to stand on either side of Lawyer Ching. She looked straight into Lawyer Chang's eyes and said word by word, I want the 20% transfer contract of ATV. Lawyer Chang's fingers trembled, and he took another puff. That's impossible. Then I have to apologize to Lawyer Ching. I'm going to destroy a seemingly happy family. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. Lawyer Chang's face was a little gray, and he roared, What exactly do you want to do? Do you know that this is illegal? My lawyer's license will be revoked at any time. Do you believe that you can settle it and take advantage of loopholes? Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. I don't ask for much. Before this document takes effect, disappear, and don't let Mrs. Su or Su Qing know. This can only be temporary. Lawyer Ching was a little upset. In the future, if she doesn't trust people and changes people, I can't do anything. So, give me the original. There was a deep meaning in Yi Liangqiu's eyes. Lawyer Cheng was stunned, and then he said angrily, Lunatic. Lawyer Cheng, let me remind you that you still have 20 minutes, and you have to do a lot of things in these 20 minutes. Yi Liangqiu was expressionless. Lawyer Cheng stared at her for a long time, then he got up, opened the safe, took out a file bag, and threw it in front of Yi Liangqiu. You can do whatever you want, but don't involve me. Yi Liangqiu took out a few pieces of paper and looked at them. There were indeed a few stamps on them. She took out the original and burned the other pieces of paper. Looking at the fire, she said softly, Create the illusion of a fire. You should know how to. Those transfer agreements turned into ashes in the blink of an eye. Yi Liangqiu took out a check of 50 million yuan and gently pushed it in front of Lawyer Ching. This is Lawyer Chang's fee for your hard work. Please forgive me if I have offended you. Lawyer Ching looked at the 50 million and pursed his lips. Where's the photo? As long as you don't do anything to harm me, these photos will never be known by others. Yi Liangqiu smiled and left with the original copy of Mrs. Su's shares. The two security guards also left. Lawyer Ching, who was left behind, fiercely took a drag of his cigarette, then kicked the desk down and scolded, What the hell is this? ATV President's Office. Yi Liangqiu placed the original copy in front of Su Shiqing. Su Shiqing stared at it. For more than 20 years, he had never seen the original copy because Mrs. Su kept it in her private insurance. But now, Liangqiu did it for him. After locking the original copy in his safe, he turned around and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Thank you for your hard work. Yi Liangqiu just smiled faintly. Su Shiqing thought for a moment. I'm going to appoint you as the deputy president of ATV, Liangqiu. I believe that with your ability, you will definitely be able to do it. Because she was ruthless enough and unscrupulous enough. His heir should be like this. Su Cheng was too petty and only knew how to act like a little girl. Yi Liangqiu did not refuse. Thank you, Dad. Chapter 1440. At this time, Su Shiqing thought of something and his heart wavered, but in the end, he just thought about it and didn't take action. This Saturday, I will host a dinner party to formally introduce you to the people in the circle. Su Shiqing patted her shoulder. In the future, it will all be yours. Don't let Dad down. Yi Liangqiu nodded. I will try my best. Su Shiqing's decision was opposed by Mrs. Su. At the dinner table, she naturally couldn't say anything. But when she returned to the bedroom, she fired at Su Shiqing. Shiqing, you said that ATV will be left to Qingqing. Su Shiqing took off his coat and threw it at the end of the bed. He loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed. His voice was slightly tired. That was in the past. Now, Su is back. Su, you only know her. Where is Qingqing? Mrs. Su's voice was a little emotional. Her heart was also sad. She couldn't like her own daughter and was even afraid to see her two cold eyes. Su Shiqing's eyes were cold. Su is our biological daughter. Are you asking me to kick my biological daughter out of the house? Mrs. Su was stunned and then became a little absent-minded. No, Shiqing, that's not what I meant. It's best if it's not. Su Shiqing unbuttoned his shirt and walked into the bathroom. Also, you didn't care about ATV before, so don't interfere in the future. Mrs. Su suddenly fell onto the sofa. At night, she lay beside Su Shiqing and listened to his shallow breathing. She knew that he wasn't asleep. Quietly, she put her hand into his pajamas and softly called his name. She seemed to be trying to reconcile with him. But her hand was taken out. Su Shiqing's tone was very indifferent. It's too late. I'm a little tired. Mrs. Su felt like she had been slapped in the face. After so many years, he rejected her for the first time. She couldn't find a way out. She lay straight and felt a little bored. On Wednesday, ATV held a press conference and announced that Yi Liangqiu would be the vice president of ATV's marketing department. At the same time, Su Shiqing also announced her identity. Su Shiqing said somewhat emotionally, Liangqiu is my long-lost daughter, so I will do everything I can to make it up to her. The implication was obvious. The successor of ATV must be Yi Liangqiu. The media was in an uproar. This was simply a godly reversal. Of course, a reporter asked a sharp question, Mr. Yi, in your heart, is love more important or your career more important? Yi Liangqiu smiled. For me, family is the most important thing. The reporter was obviously stunned for a moment. He felt that Yi Liangqiu was a rich girl, but it was boring to continue asking. On the other end, in King Entertainment's executive office, Qin Anlin sat on the sofa, holding a glass of wine in one hand and an invitation in the other. At the banquet where Yi Liangqiu was the vice president of ATV, Old Man Su has put in a lot of money. It's obvious that he wants his own daughter to take over ATV. He's already preparing for it, Kim said softly. He was really a little worried. He looked at Qin Anlin and asked, will President Qin go to the banquet? Yes. Qin Anlin put down the glass in his hand. Why not? After Kim left, Qin Anlin watched the video countless times. Damn it, even though she was so hateful, he still loved her so much. Chapter 1441. Perhaps his worries were unfounded. She had just returned to the Su family and had already done something big for Su Shiqing. She must be riding on the crest of success. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. Liangqiu, you said that family is the most important. Then in your heart, am I not considered family? Does it mean nothing to you when I say I love you? Don't tell me you don't even want Muyun anymore. I don't believe it. Saturday came quickly. ATV held the dinner party at the GM Hotel in Boyle, which was previously owned by the Xingyuan Corporation. It was a star-studded night. The celebrities on the red carpet could be compared to the beauty of the fashion festival. Qin Anlin came alone. Before the red carpet, he met Yi Liangqiu. Under the strong night wind and countless flashing lights, he walked towards her. She was dressed in an expensive gown, like a goddess, while he was dressed in black. His face looked even colder under the flashing lights. Finally, he walked in front of her and said in a hoarse voice, "Congratulations." She didn't make a sound. She just stood face to face with him. At this moment, her eyes were moist, but she smiled faintly. It was a public relations smile. "Thank you, President Qin." A reporter asked them to take a photo together. Yi Liangqiu cooperated and stood next to Qin Anlin. They were originally standing side by side, but at that moment, he placed his hand on her shoulder. His warm palm landed on her shoulder. The moment their skin touched, her pores opened. She was a little dazed. He tightened his grip on her, not giving her a chance to struggle. "Mr. Yi, keep smiling. Otherwise, tomorrow's newspaper will make up a story. You don't want to embarrass yourself, do you?" Qin Anlin's voice was low and hoarse. Yi Bingqiu tilted her head and glanced at him. Seeing his calm expression, she snorted lightly. "I forgot that Boss Qin's acting skills have always been very good." "Is that so?" "Mr. Yi must have forgotten that you're still a contracted artist of King Entertainment. Now that you've signed with another company, King Entertainment can totally sue you." He also laughed coldly. Yi Liangqiu put on the most perfect smile for the reporters, then quietly stepped on his foot. "Bastard, then go ahead and sue." However, she did not manage to steady her feet and was about to fall straight down. In just a second, her body was caught, and she was half lying in his embrace. His arm was around her waist, and his gaze was deep. "Let go of me." She was annoyed, and her posture was very awkward. "No," he said with a cold face. Yi Liangqiu was furious and stepped on him again. He actually didn't hide and let her do whatever she wanted. There was a touch of warmth in Yi Liangqiu's eyes, and her voice was a little choked. "Qin Anlin, let me go. Can you let me go? We can't be together, at least not now. I don't want anything to happen to you. Anlin, I'm begging you, let go." He probably saw her emotions, but in the end, he still let go. When he let go of her, he just said lightly, "Mr. Yi, I have something to remind you, you're pregnant." Yi Liangqiu wanted to step on him again, but at this moment, Su Shiqing came over. He looked at Qin Anlin, and his tone was especially affectionate. "Anlin is here." Qin Anlin also greeted him, "Mr. Su. You're too polite." Su Shiqing smiled faintly, not letting anything slip. "Why isn't your mother here?" Chapter 1442. He said it very casually, but Yi Liangqiu couldn't stand it because his words were full of thorns. Qin Anlin didn't say much and quickly left. Yi Liangqiu stared at his back for a while, lost in thought. "If you really like him, Dad won't object." Su Shiqing's tone was loving. He was sincere when he said that. But he was also sincere when he said that he wanted to take over King Entertainment. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and smiled. "Dad, forget it. Living with a frustrated man won't make you happy in the end." Su Shiqing asked, "Mu Yun, are you willing to do that?" Yi Liangqiu swirled the wine in her glass. She didn't drink it and just smiled. "When we succeed, Mu Yun will naturally come back to me." Su Shiqing nodded. "Dad will fulfill your wish." He took her to visit the big shots in the industry and introduced them to them for her convenience in the future. That night, Su Qing didn't come because Mrs. Su wasn't feeling too comfortable. Su Shiqing's bias let Mrs. Su know that Qing probably wouldn't be able to hold her ground in ATV in the future. But fortunately, she had 20%, so Qing wouldn't have to suffer in the future. Su Shiqing lowered his eyes to look at his daughter. He was more and more convinced that she was the most suitable successor. Liangqiu had a child in her stomach. Regardless of whether she got married or not, this child would be the Su family's blood. "Dad, I'm going to the balcony to get some fresh air." Yi Liangqiu's voice was very soft. Su Shiqing nodded. "Go ahead." He saw a trace of exhaustion in her eyes. Yi Liangqiu walked to the balcony and sat on the sofa, which was separated from the noisy hall by a curtain. The place she was in now was like a small world of her own. She was a little tired, and not just physically. She lay on the sofa, her high heels casually tossed aside. The night wind blew on her face, sending waves of coldness through her. But it was also hot. Half awake, she reached out and touched it. She actually cried. "Since you've gotten what you wanted and you don't have to be a subordinate anymore, why are you crying?" A cold voice rang out. She stood up almost instantly and looked at the man in front of her in a daze. There was still a tear on her face. "Why are you crying? Shouldn't you be smiling?" He stood proudly in the dark, like a god. Just now, he saw her following Su Shiqing among those men, watching her smile at those people, but when she looked down, the disappointment and loneliness in her eyes could not deceive him. Little liar. He was obviously unhappy. As for him, he never knew that he cared so much about her smiling at others. Those people were such an eyesore. He simply wanted to get rid of them all, leaving not a single one alive. She reached out to gently wipe away her tears and tried to speak in a cold voice. "You don't have to worry about it, President Qin." "Really?" His voice was cold, but the words that came out of his mouth were shameless. "Then why do I feel that your eyes are filled with? Come, hug me." A hint of anger appeared on her face. "Of course not. You know very well whether I did or not." He bent down and placed his hands on both sides of her body. His gaze was deep. "Don't you know how you look when you lie?" His slender fingers gently pinched her earlobe. "Here, it's all red." "I didn't." She shrank her body, not letting him touch her. Chapter 1443. She bit her lip and looked at him in a daze. There was a deep fire in Qin Anlan's eyes. He sat next to her, dressed in a formal suit, and was rarely handsome. Holding one of her feet, he looked like a rare forbidden jade. Looking at her, his face was cold. "Scream if you feel comfortable." She wanted to retract her foot, but he held it down. She shrank again. He used some brute force and scolded her, "Don't forget that you're pregnant." Yi Liangqiu calmed down a little and glared at him. "Then let go of me." She was especially beautiful tonight, and she looked even more languid as she reclined. Qin Anlan looked at her for a long time before he suddenly let go of her. He looked at her and asked coldly, "If you're not happy, why are you still staying?" She retracted her foot and bit her lip. "I'm not unhappy. Qin Anlan, as you can see, I'm now the vice president of ATV, and I'll be the heir in the future. Why wouldn't I be open?" His gaze was deep. "Then tell me, what are you happy about? Are you happy because of power? You live so tirelessly every day. Have you ever thought about what you look like when you smile?" He chuckled. "Will you be happier than when you're by my side?" "None of your business." She turned her face away awkwardly and then went to put on the high heels, but he stopped her. "Your feet are almost worn out. Are you sure you still want to wear them?" His gaze was fixed on her eyes. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and didn't say anything for a long time. She just hugged her knees. She hugged herself and looked up at the starry sky of City B. Qin Anlin, you don't have to stand on the highest point to drink chicken soup for me. Are you willing to give up the power that you have? There are many things that I can't do. But Yi Liangqiu, you can choose. His black eyes were deep. And I respect your choice. As you wish, the marriage is cancelled. He laughed self-deprecatingly. I, Qin Anlin, will not force a woman I can't control. I hope you find a woman you can control soon. She snorted and finally couldn't help but kick him. Give me back my shoes. He looked at her and suddenly picked up her shoes and threw them out of the window. She was stunned. What if you hit someone by throwing things around? Below is the swimming pool. He looked at her calmly. It's closed now. She had nothing else to say and was about to leave barefoot, but he quickly stopped her. You're not allowed to leave. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. When she fell into his arms, he reached out to cushion her. Then, she was kissed. Woo! She raised her head and struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. His kiss carried a hint of anger as he kissed her from top to bottom. When he encountered any obstacles, he reached out and tore them away. She felt her body lighten, and the gown had already slid down to her waist. Qin Anlin, this is the balcony. Are you crazy? She hit his back frantically, afraid that he would do something irrational. However, he didn't stop. He kissed her so violently that he even hurt her. Finally, she calmed down and let him kiss her. In the narrow space, there was only his panting, Liangqiu, I can't take it anymore. He lifted her up and adjusted her gown. There was a hint of desire in his eyes. Chapter 1444. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him in despair. The love between a man and a woman could sometimes overcome all rationality. At that moment, he wanted her, and she wanted it too. She didn't know when, but he brought her to the hotel suite on the top floor. When she kicked the door open, she was pressed against the door and kissed. She was lying on the door, and Qin Anlin was behind her. After the initial ferocity, he began to torture her slowly, kissing her and praising her. She was panting. She felt that he hadn't. What was he waiting for? But he seemed to have a lifetime of patience. He just kissed her until she was on fire. Finally, she burst into tears. Qin Anlin, you jerk. I think I'm a jerk too. He laughed at himself and carried her, afraid that the hard door would hurt her. He picked her up and lifted her up high, kissing her as he walked. His voice was extremely hoarse as he said, undress me. She shuddered and then looked at him with watery eyes. If you don't want to, I'll put you down, okay? He said, as if he was really going to put her down. She quickly hugged his neck with one hand and unbuttoned his shirt with the other. Her movements were a little clumsy. She looked up at him and then looked down. Afraid? His voice was emotionless. Don't do it if you're afraid. She didn't say anything. She just hugged him and pressed her lips on his. Her body slowly lay down on the bed. It was an extreme, yet another extreme. This time, she was especially long. She couldn't come back to her senses for a long time. She lay in his arms, her body covered in sweat. She closed her eyes and was still immersed in the aftertaste. Qin Anlin's palm touched her back and patted her gently. His movements were unbelievably gentle. In such a quiet night, the words that came out of his mouth were extremely heart-stirring. Why are you willing to do it with me? He paused. I don't want to hear about your physical needs or one-night stands. Lying in his arms, Yi Bingqiu slowly opened her eyes. There was still a teardrop on her long eyelashes, making her look especially fragile. She propped herself up, and her long, sweaty hair hit his chest, tickling him from body to heart. What else? What do you want to hear me say? She propped her chin up and looked at his handsome face, her hand lightly stroking it. However, he grabbed her fingers, and his gaze was even a little cold. Yi Liangqiu, do you think that everything in this world is so beautiful? You want power and me at the same time, right? I never thought I could have it both ways. She smiled and tried to withdraw her hand, but she could not. He held it firmly. So, you cancelled your wedding with me, so you left Muyun and me. He stared into her eyes. You're so cruel. Since you're so ruthless, why did you still sleep with me? He sneered. What are you thinking? She did not make a sound. He continued, are you keeping me in suspense so that I'll wait for you at the same spot? Her body trembled. He was smarter than she had expected. He knew exactly what she was thinking. Besides being aroused, part of the reason why she had sex with him just now was because of what he said. It was a little embarrassing, but she would never admit it. Chapter 1445. You're thinking too much. She smiled. We're both adults. There's nothing to lose by just going to bed. He stared at her for a long time, as if he was judging her. Yeah, you don't need to take birth control pills, right? He said mockingly as he got out of bed to get dressed. He didn't shy away from getting dressed in front of her. His muscular body made her blush. Qin Anlin glanced at her. You want to stay the night? They disappeared from the banquet for about an hour, and it wasn't over yet. He thought that she wouldn't want anyone to find out about them. Yi Liangqiu snorted. Of course not. She picked up the dress and felt her hands shaking. In the end, Qin Anlin took it from her and put it on for her. His movements were very skillful. She wondered how many women's clothes he had taken off to be able to do such a good job. Qin Anlin probably knew what she was thinking and snorted. I've always only taken off women's clothes, but I've never helped women put on their clothes. He thought about it and seemed to be a little angry with her. He added, I'm doing it for the sake of the daughter in your stomach. Maybe it's a son. She was indifferent. At this moment, she was sitting on the edge of the bed. He bent over and looked at her, which made her hair stand. After a long time, he said, didn't I go and say hello to my daughter just now? You're shameless. She blushed and glared at him. He gestured for her to keep quiet and then looked at her terrible appearance. Your hair is loose and your makeup is off. How did you hide it from Su Shiqing? I don't need to. I'll just say that I seduced you. Yi Liangqiu sneered. She put her hair up and reapplied her lipstick. Just then, the doorbell rang. Her hands slowed down, and she looked at him with a helpless look in her eyes. Scared? He sneered. Aren't you not afraid? Didn't you say that you seduced me? She couldn't say a word and just stared at him. You look much cuter this way. He pinched her face and walked to the door to open it. At the door was a waiter with a beautifully wrapped paper box in his hand. Qin Anlin took it, closed the door, and slowly walked in front of her. Under her slightly stunned gaze, he squatted down and said, sit properly and stretch out your legs. She was stunned and didn't react for a long time. Stretch your legs and put on your shoes. Don't tell me that Mr. Yi can't even understand words now. His voice was a little cold. She looked at him and said nothing. You are tall and your skirt is long. Su Shiqing won't notice. His tone was very calm, as if he had been prepared. Unless you're willing to go down and fish up the shoes. She managed to stretch out her foot, but she gave him a kick on the shoulder in a petulant manner. He reached out to hold it. He looked up at her. Yi Liangqiu, if you leave me, you won't have the chance to act coquettishly anymore." After saying that, he hit the sole of her foot. However, it was very light and could be considered as a small revenge. She had to admit that he had flirted with her. She looked down at him and said, "It sounds like you have a lot of experience." Chapter 1446. Under the refraction of the chandelier, his handsome face was mesmerizing as he focused on helping her put on her shoes. Yi Liangqiu looked down at him with a hint of concentration in her eyes. There was a touch of softness in her heart, and her breathing became shallow. After a long time, she asked softly, "Why are you still so good to me?" He gently put down one of her feet and picked up the other. He looked up and smiled. "I was very comfortable just now, so now I'm letting you feel comfortable. Isn't that fair?" She kicked him, so he couldn't speak properly. Qin Anlin held her feet and did not move for a long time. She felt uneasy, but his lips were tightly pursed. After a long silence, he said, "Yi Liangqiu, if you're going to be cruel to me, then be firm. Otherwise, I'm afraid I won't be able to stop myself from tying you up and never letting you come back." When he said this, her throat seemed to be blocked by something, and she felt indescribably uncomfortable. "Don't you hate me?" Her fingers clenched as she tried to restrain herself from hugging him. He looked at her for a long time before he chuckled softly. "Yes." After helping her put on the other shoe, he didn't stand up immediately. Instead, he said in a low voice, "Yi Liangqiu, before I change my mind, before my patience runs out, remember to come back." As he spoke, he looked up at her. Their eyes met, and she could not say a word to refute him. "All right, let's go. You go out first." He finally got up and stood in front of her, blocking most of the lights for her. She was surrounded by his shadow, and it felt like she was being hugged. After a long time, she slowly got up. Wearing flat shoes was very comfortable, and she did not feel uncomfortable at all. Moreover, he was surprisingly gentle during the sex just now, so she did not feel uncomfortable at all. Perhaps because of her expression, there was a hint of inscrutability on his face. "Just take it as my gift to celebrate Mr. Ye's appointment." He owed her again, and she glared at him. Qin Anlin also sneered. His fingers pinched her chin, and he lowered his head and whispered, "Why? Is there someone else who can satisfy you? Do they know what kind of method you like? Pervert." She wanted to step on him again, but her arm was held by him, and her body fell gently into his arms. "I think Mr. Yi should always remember that you are a pregnant woman," he said mercilessly, and then let go of her. Yi Liangqiu walked out angrily, and he looked at her from behind with a deep gaze. "Liangqiu, you said that you want power, but why are you so devoted when you are with me? Are you really willing to give it up? I don't believe that you are willing to give up on Mu Yun." When he thought of his own son, Qin Anlin felt a bit of a headache. He didn't cry or make a fuss. He was as calm as a little adult. He only said, "Mommy will come back one day." He was much calmer than him, so calm that Qin Anlin was about to vomit blood. "I, Shen, Su, Su. Of Su Su, I, Qin, and Su, as, of Su, he felt. Downstairs, he saw that Yi Liangqiu was already by Su Shiqing's side. He was leaning on the side, looking at her with a glass of red wine. His gaze was so focused that it made her blush. Su Shiqing looked at Yi Liangqiu and asked softly, "I went to the balcony to look for you. Where did you go?" "I wasn't feeling well, so I went to the atrium to get some fresh air." She smiled. Su Shiqing patted her hand. "You came at the right time. The ball is about to start. Have you thought of a candidate for the dance?" Chapter 1447. Su Shiqing disagreed. What's the point of dancing with an old man like me? Just now, Director Liang wanted to invite you for the first dance. Liangqiu, you know what to do. Of course. Yi Liangqiu didn't mind. When she was an artist, this kind of thing happened a lot. Some people could only be dealt with and not offended. Liang Sai was in his 40s. He looked elegant and was quite gentlemanly. However, Yi Liangqiu wasn't naive enough to think that he was a gentleman deep down in his bones. This kind of man had two different appearances on the outside. He was a gentleman on the outside, but in a shady place, he was a beast. She accepted one dance, and Director Liang asked for another one. Yi Liangqiu was helpless and could only accompany him for another dance. But halfway through, her waist was held by a strong arm, and she fell into a warm embrace. Director Liang was about to explode. Which shameless person was stealing his woman? But a fat female yiksha was stuffed into his arms. He wanted to throw her away, but when he looked closely, he realized that it was the female yiksha at home. Great! Director Liang, you're quite flirtatious when you come out. Mrs. Liang pulled his ear and growled, "Go home, or I'll ask my father to remove you from your position tomorrow." Everyone sighed. This Director Liang was also a habitual offender. Not long ago, he got a female university student pregnant and settled it with the power of the female yiksha's family. Now, he dared to come out and fool around again. Director Liang was embarrassed, but he didn't dare to offend his yiksha, so he left obediently. When Mrs. Liang passed by Qin Anlin, she gave him a look. This gigolo was really handsome. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a good man devoted to his wife, she would also want to have a taste of him. This Liang guy thought he was so powerful. He charged in bed for a week, and it lasted for 5 minutes. Look at this Chief Qin. He's good-looking, well-dressed, and well-built. He looks like a useful person. Mrs. Liang didn't forget to give Qin Anlin a flirtatious look, which almost blinded Yi Qiu. She looked at Qin Anlin, "Did you find him?" Then he snorted coldly, "What a heavy taste." "Yes, I also like to eat your feet, eat you." His voice was not soft. Yi Liangqiu hurriedly covered his mouth. "Are you crazy?" He looked at her deeply and then bit her palm lightly. It was a very numb feeling. Yi Liangqiu bit her lips and glared at him, "If you don't move it away, I can't guarantee what I'll do." His voice was low and hoarse. His eyes had a faint glow as he looked at her. Their dance steps were not messed up at all. She abruptly moved her hand away and felt that her palm was wet. He was a freak. "Mr. Yi, stop gritting your teeth. Remember, no matter when, don't reveal your emotions," he said teasingly. She lifted her head and spun around under his lead. The combination of a handsome man and a beautiful woman, coupled with their elegant dance steps, was a beautiful picture. There's no need to trouble President Qin. She didn't give him a good look. Qin Anlin laughed in a low voice. "Because it's time to test Mr. Yi." She was stunned for a moment, not quite understanding what he meant, but he had already lowered his head and kissed her. It was a solid, wet kiss. The contact between their lips was magnified countless times. In front of countless people, he announced his possession of her. Chapter 1448. She was in pain. She parted her lips naturally and he penetrated her forcefully. Everyone around them exclaimed, "Gosh, they were having sex for real." Moreover, they were a couple who had just broken up. Yi Liangqiu struggled, but he pressed the back of her head with his palm, not giving her a chance to escape. At the same time, he kissed her more forcefully. Entangled and entangled. This scene made everyone blush and their hearts beat faster. Especially Su Shiqing, who had a complicated expression on his face. His daughter had been kissed like this by Qin Anlin at the dinner party. Not only that, he even left a mark on her neck. What the fuck, was this a live broadcast? Just when Su Shiqing was about to lose his temper, Qin Anlin had already let go. Slap. A slap landed on his handsome face. She stood face to face with him, panting slightly from the long kiss. He licked his lower lip. It tastes good. Qin Anlin, you bastard. She raised her hand and he caught it. His eyes were deep. Are you sure you want to deal with these people? If Mrs. Liang hadn't appeared just now, how would you have gotten away? Did you say that you're pregnant? His tone was low and stern, and he looked at her with a burning gaze. I don't need your concern, she said coldly and kept her distance from him. Anlin, I don't want you to get close to me. If you do, my heart will be in a mess, and I'm afraid that you're not safe. He looked at her coldly. Is that so? She didn't say anything else and just stared at him. The people around them were confused. Were they in love or enemies? Qin Anlin stroked his slightly red face and looked up at her. You've slapped me more than 5 times. Yi Liangqiu, think about what you're relying on. Think about it. With that, he turned around and left without looking back. Yi Liangqiu stood where she was, and the dinner party had been ruined by this accident. Of course, no one had any ideas about Yi Liangqiu anymore because she was pregnant, and it was Qin Anlin's child. On the way back, she sat in the back seat of the car in a daze. She propped her chin on her hand and looked at the night view outside the car silently. Su Shiqing sighed. Liangqiu, do you love him very much? She turned her head and looked at him. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she was in a sorry state. Shaking his head slowly, Zhang Xian said, No. I just can't bear to part with Mu Yun. Then why did you leave Mu Yun behind? Su Shiqing asked casually. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes. Because Mu Yun was born with a disease. Once he bleeds, he can't stop. He also has Rh-negative blood. He's only safe around Qin Anlin. Su Shiqing nodded. That's right. Yi Liangqiu leaned her head against the back seat and didn't say anything else. Su Shiqing suddenly said, Do you blame Dad? After all, he had wanted to take advantage of her marriage with Qin Anlin. He did have some ideas, but now, he was hesitating because if he did that, he would probably lose his daughter. Su Shiqing had always been clear about what he wanted the most. Without an heir, even if he took everything, what was the point? Therefore, Su Shiqing quickly adjusted his strategy and moved Liangqiu with family affection. Back at the Su family, he looked at her with a touch of warmth. Rest early. Chapter 1449. She slowly went upstairs and walked to her room. Su Cheng was lying on her bed, holding a toy in her hand. She looked at her and asked, Did you have a good time tonight? Yi Liangqiu walked in slowly and looked at Su Cheng. Su Cheng was dressed very skimpily and cute. There was not much more fabric than underwear. Yi Liangqiu slowly took out her mobile phone from her handbag and took 2 photos of her. It looks good. I will give it to the reporters tomorrow. I believe many people will worship you as the goddess of otaku. Su Cheng sat up straight. Delete the photos. Be a good boy. If you want to seduce someone, you should seduce a man. It's useless to lie on my bed. Yi Liangqiu's tone was disgusted. Su Cheng was furious. She had been waiting for her here tonight, but when she came back, she sneered at her. She bit her lip. I really want to coexist peacefully with you. She stared at Yi Liangqiu. Do you think you can stand firmly in this house without my help? Yi Liangqiu went into the bathroom and filled the bath water. Then she came out again. I have never intended to coexist peacefully with you. You want ATV? Su Qing smiled softly. Her smile was a little strange. Do you think Su Shiqing will be willing to give ATV to you after he has used you? She got up from the bed and walked a few steps to Yi Liangqiu. You can wait. Wait until he is too old to move. Wait for about 20 or 30 years. By then, you will be an old lady. Are you sure you can wait? Of course, I have 20% in my hands now. If we work together, there is a chance to oust Su Shiqing from the position of CEO. It depends on whether you dare to do it and whether you have this ambition. Su Cheng's eyes had a touch of inscrutability, which Yi Liangqiu could not understand. Does Su Qing also have such ambition? She felt that something was wrong. You must be curious why I'm doing this. Su Qing sneered. You've seen it for yourself. A shrewd adoptive father and a neurotic adoptive mother. My future lies in their hands. Today, they say they love me, but tomorrow, they might kick me out of the house. That's why I might as well become the master myself. Yi Liangqiu looked straight at Su Qing. If your mother heard what you said, she would probably be very sad. There was a hint of mockery in her words. Su Cheng's smile grew colder. That's your mother, not mine. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. She just looked at Su Qing. It doesn't matter if you do it or not. The Su family has never lived in peace. There is only peace on the surface. Even husband and wife have their schemes. Su Qing looked at her. Yi Liangqiu, this family doesn't have the warmth you want. Is that so? Yi Liangqiu sneered. Then why don't you leave? Su Cheng's face froze. Yi Liangqiu sent the photo on her mobile phone. She said in a calm tone, I've sent the photo. I think you should ask your agent to do PR now. Also, the clothes are very see-through. After saying that, she opened the door. Su Cheng's face was pale. She gritted her teeth. Yi Liangqiu. If you don't go, I'm afraid I'll report it to the higher-ups tomorrow. She reminded Su Qing kindly. Su Chen returned to her room in exasperation. She called her manager and asked for Yi Liangqiu's name to be sent to PR. However, 10 minutes later, she realized she had been tricked by Yi Liangqiu again. The photo was not sent at all. Chapter 1450. ATV's Important Shareholders Meeting. Su Shiqing introduced Yi Liangqiu to the important shareholders and announced that Yi Liangqiu would be in charge of the cooperation project between ATV and King Entertainment. Naturally, some shareholders objected because Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin had a past. What if she turned out to be a spy for such a big collaboration? What should she do? Su Shiqing looked down and naturally understood their concerns. He said slowly, Liangqiu is my daughter. I believe her heart is on ATV's side. Yi Liangqiu looked at the shareholders below. Among them was Mrs. Su. She had been expressionless and did not express her support for her. She smiled slightly. My marriage with President Qin has fallen through. ATV is my father's blood and sweat. My surname is Su. I think I want ATV to be good more than anyone else. The shareholders were a little hesitant. Su Shiqing had previously revealed that the successor would be Yi Liangqiu. No matter how stupid she was, she would not give up such an opportunity to benefit others. Just as everyone was hesitating, Mrs. Su said, I may have to give up this vote, and it will be decided by my daughter, Su Qing. Everyone was shocked. Su Shiqing's expression was particularly ugly. He looked at Mrs. Su. Mrs. Su acted as if she did not see it and continued lightly, the shares under my name have been transferred to Qing. In the future, she will be the second largest shareholder of ATV. At this time, the door opened and Su Qing walked in. She sat down next to Mrs. Su and smiled sweetly. Mrs. Su patted her hand. "Don't let Mom down." When she did this, she did not dare to look at Yi Liangqiu because, in a sense, she had betrayed her own daughter. She knew what this 20% meant. It meant that Su Cheng's starting point was much higher than Yi Liangqiu's. This 20% had the right to vote. If Su Qing did not agree to something, Yi Liangqiu could not do it. Su Qing nodded obediently, then looked at Yi Liangqiu and smiled sweetly. "Sister Liangqiu, I may have to let you down. In order to be responsible for ATV's shareholders, not only can I not agree to your contact with King Entertainment, but I also doubt your intentions in ATV." There was another round of discussion. Some shareholders were obviously a little impatient. This was obviously a power struggle between the rich and powerful, and the cannon fodder were the shareholders, so it was their interests that were harmed. "Why do you say that?" Yi Liangqiu was still sitting upright, and his expression didn't change much. Su Cheng's smile became even sweeter. "Because you're pregnant, Qin Anlan's child. In order to express your loyalty to ATV, you abort this child, and I will believe it." Yi Liangqiu sneered. "Su Cheng, it's true that your surname is Su, but compared to the child in my belly, you don't even have a drop of blood in the Su family. What right do you have to talk about my loyalty to ATV here? Because of your past with Qin Anlan." Su Cheng's expression was a little ugly. Yi Liangqiu glanced around and said slowly, "I very much suspect that you, who have been rumored to have had a relationship with Qin Anlan for several years, are venting your personal feelings. Su Cheng, this is a company, not a home. I have already broken up with Qin Anlan. If you like him, you don't have to do it this way." Su Cheng's face turned green. When it came to reversing black and white, she was actually no match for Yi Liangqiu. When did she like Qin Anlan? Chapter 1451. After Mrs. Su finished speaking, Su Qing smiled smugly at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu didn't have much of an expression on her face. She just asked calmly, "What about the procedures?" Su Qing froze for a moment and then looked at Mrs. Su. Mrs. Su's expression didn't look too good. Then, she called Lawyer Qing. "Lawyer Qing, come over and bring the documents from last time. Have they been stamped?" No one knew what the other side said, but Mrs. Su's expression turned even uglier. She almost smashed the phone. "It's been so many days, and you tell me you burned it. What, burned the original, you make me, bastard." Mrs. Su threw her phone and was furious. She had been pampered since she was a child and her temper wasn't very good, so she wasn't very tolerant. But her outburst of anger gave the shareholders of ATV an idea. This was simply nonsense. Was this a market? This was a company. Were Mrs. Su and Su Qing playing house? It was such a serious question. It was a mess. Su Shiqing looked at his wife and said coldly, "If the original is also lost, then you won't be qualified to participate in the shareholders' meeting." Su Shiqing. Is there such a rule? Mrs. Su was furious. "I want Qing Qing to take over the company." After she said that, the air seemed to freeze. There were some things that could be said openly and some things that couldn't be said openly. When she spoke like this, she didn't just make her position clear, it even completely destroyed the cold mother-daughter relationship between her and Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su also knew that she had said something wrong. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Her gaze fell on Yi Liangqiu's face. Her lips moved, but in the end, she didn't say anything. She had already made her choice between her biological daughter and adopted daughter. Finally, Su Shiqing spoke up. "Let's vote. Those who agree, raise your hand. The shareholders were a little hesitant at first, but then they thought about it. If they were to fall into Su Cheng's hands, they didn't know what would happen. And Yi Liangqiu looked steady, just like Su Shiqing when he was young. Therefore, they chose to bet on Yi Liangqiu and raised their hands. Su Qing suddenly leaned back in her chair. She looked at Mrs. Su and said softly, "Mom, it's okay. It doesn't matter if I don't want anything. Everything in the Su family belongs to Sister Liangqiu." Mrs. Su was both angry and sad. It took her a long time to calm down. "Qing, you are always so understanding." She didn't notice the disappointment in Yi Liangqiu's eyes when she said that. She remembered that when she was young, her mother would always hug her and kiss her while calling her little Su Su. Her mother had told her to give her the best of everything. She couldn't tell if those were her memories or her imagination. She only knew that she could not cry, or she would be laughed at. "Yi Liangqiu, don't cry. It's nothing. Oh. You didn't have a mother for so many years. Now that you're a mother, you have to protect Mu Yun and the child in her belly. You have to let them always have a mother." Su Shiqing released a long sigh in his heart. His wife had really disappointed him. However, he also had other thoughts about Su Qing. In the past, Qing wasn't like this. She also wouldn't go out of her way to please her mother. Recently, however, he didn't know if it was just his imagination, but Su Qing was constantly creating conflict. It was as though she was trying to force her mother to make a choice. Chapter 1452. The meeting ended. Su Qing followed behind Mrs. Su and said cautiously, "Mom, don't be angry. Sister Liangqiu didn't want to fight with me on purpose. Besides, these belong to her." Mrs. Su stopped and turned to look at Su Qing. She then said slowly, Qing, why are you so silly? You are always thinking of others. Mom is afraid that you will end up with nothing." Su Qing hugged Mrs. Su and pressed her face against Mrs. Su's. "Mom, I know that you love me. But if you are so biased, Sister Liangqiu will be unhappy. It's only right that Mom is biased towards you. You have been by Mom's side all these years." Mrs. Su said, her gaze paused. Yi Liangqiu slowly walked over from the passageway to the side and brushed past him. Mrs. Su's body froze and she couldn't move for a long time. She heard it. Su Cheng's voice was very soft. Mrs. Su froze for a long time before she found her voice again. "We can't go back." She and Su couldn't go back. The mother and daughter, who were once so close, were now strangers. She couldn't love the child raised by someone else. She was right in front of her and they were living together, but Mrs. Su felt distant. She was afraid to see her. Even when she was alone, she would think that it was good not to come back. At least her peaceful life wouldn't be disturbed. Mrs. Su looked at Yi Liangqiu's back and let out a long sigh. She went home first, but she did not expect a storm to come. In the bedroom, Su Shiqing was very angry at her. Mrs. Su wasn't someone to be trifled with. After they argued, she was tied up with a tie. "Su Shiqing, what are you doing?" Mrs. Su was in her pajamas and looked terrified. Su Shiqing held a glass of red wine in his hand and looked at her coldly. "Suya, how have I treated you all these years?" Mrs. Su looked at his expressionless face and cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She had seen Su Shiqing like this a few times. The last time, he did something terrible. Her eyes were wide open, and she kept shifting her body, backing away from him. "Why don't you say it, huh?" Su Shiqing slowly drank half a glass of wine, and then put the rest of the wine on the bedside table. He took a pill and shook it. He smiled and looked at his wife. You can't say it, can you? Big beads of sweat dripped down from Mrs. Sue's forehead, and soon, her clothes were soaked. She sat on her knees and kept moving backwards. Her voice trembled. Shih-Ching, don't do this to me. I've endured enough. He grabbed her body and threw her hard, causing her to fall onto the soft bed. His body was on both sides of her body. He pinched her cheeks with one hand and forced her to open her mouth. He held the cup with one hand and looked at her with narrowed eyes. You have two choices now. First, transfer 20% to Liangqiu. Second, drink this glass of wine. Mrs. Su looked at the thing in his hand in horror, her body still struggling, her voice shrill. I don't want to drink it. Drink it. It can make you happy. There was no warmth in Su Shih-Ching's eyes. Suya, you forced me to do this. Why did you force me again and again? I've endured it for so many years, but now you want to destroy everything I have. Chapter 1453. Mrs. Su cried and shook her head desperately. No, Shih-Ching, that's not what I meant. Then what do you mean? Su Shih-Ching's voice was hoarse. Just because Su Ching knows how to please you. Mrs. Su's tears fell like rain, and her face and body were in a mess. Su Shih-Ching smiled coldly. What do you know? You are just a naive missy. You've been self-centered all your life. Have you ever understood me? Mrs. Su closed her eyes. Su Shih-Ching, do you think I don't know what you've done? You liked that old woman, Hunka, and didn't hesitate to despicably break up their family. It's been so many years, do you think I don't know? His affair a few years ago was also because that young girl looked very much like Lady Qin. She dealt with it silently. He knew about it, but he didn't point it out. But that time, he didn't touch her for half a year. Did he think she didn't know? Now, Su Shih-Ching, what do you want? Kill me. Mrs. Su chuckled. Make me drink poison. He was truly ruthless. There was a touch of coldness in Su Shih-Ching's eyes. No, this is a drug that will make you want to die. A drug that will make you forget who you are, that will make you go crazy, that will make you thirst for it like a female beast. Su Shih-Ching looked down at the contents of the cup. You know too much. Don't worry, Suya. I will take good care of you in the future. He pinched her cheeks again and poured the glass of wine into her mouth while she struggled. The strong alcohol was accompanied by the medicine. She felt so uncomfortable that she choked and spat it all over Su Shih-Ching's face. He didn't care. He let go of her and took a piece of tissue to wipe it clean. He returned to the sofa and sat down. He said softly and slowly, back then, if it wasn't for your medicine, how could I have married you? Mrs. Su was kneeling. Her pajamas were almost transparent because of her sweat. She had lived a comfortable life. Therefore, although she was in her 40s, she was still fair and attractive. Especially when her breath was fluctuating, it was indescribably seductive. In the changing room of the bedroom, a man walked out. He was tall and strong, wearing only a pair of beach shorts. Mrs. Su looked at him in horror and kept moving. But when she looked at that muscular body, her body heated up. She began to crave for it. She began to feel uncomfortable, as if thousands of ants were crawling on her. The man pulled her up, his lips blocking her lips like a hot plug, hot and forceful. She felt as if she was surrounded by a wall of lava, and her entire body was on fire. His rationality was quickly burned away, leaving only a beast-like desire. As all of this happened, Su Shih-Ching just watched coldly. There was not a trace of warmth in his eyes. It was as if he was an outsider, watching everything unfold with cold eyes. This continued for 2 hours before the strong man rolled over and got off. Mrs. Su was lying down. The sweat on her body had cooled down, and the fever had also disappeared. Her mind couldn't be clearer. She looked at the man's terrifying body and Su Shurching's cold expression. Tears rolled down from the corners of her eyes. She was devastated. She was crazy. Her husband had asked someone to rape her, and he had been admiring it from the side. All these years, it turned out that he had been enduring it. It turned out that he had no feelings for her at all. She deserved it. He had finally returned the pill from back then. Do you know? Su Shurching walked up slowly and stood beside her. The only warmth I have for you is that we have Su. But you don't cherish her. Chapter 1454. Mrs. Su shook her head desperately. Her sweaty hair covered her eyes. She could not accept it. She could not accept that her husband had done this to her. Whenever he approached her, she would move backward. However, her body felt as if it was being torn apart. Don't. She cried and curled up at the corner of the bed. Her whole body was trembling, and the bruises on her body looked terrible. If you had been obedient, you wouldn't have ended up like this. However, you insisted on going against me. Su Shurching pinched her chin. Do you know what I hate the most? It's you who used your family background to oppress me and put on a high and mighty attitude. Mrs. Su's tears were almost all red. She looked at her husband and did not stop crying. Every word he said was ruthless and heart-wrenching. It turned out that all these years, he never had any feelings for her. Just because she did not do as he wanted to send her to hell. Holding her head in her hands, she let out a shrill scream of terror. She had gone completely mad. She curled up and did not speak. She looked at Su Shurching in fear. Don't come over. She kept murmuring and held her head, unwilling to see anyone. That night, she was sent to the mental hospital. As for her family, especially Mrs. Su's mother, she only took a glance and said, useless. All these years, Suyo was useless by Su Shurching's side. She actually fell in love with Su Shurching. She deserved this ending. The fact that Mrs. Su had gone crazy shocked Yi Liangqiu and Su Qing. They did not see Mrs. Su. They only heard Mrs. Su's cries when she was sent away. Her cries sounded like a ghost. Yi Liangqiu was wearing her pajamas. Her fingers clutched the front of her shirt. Her expression was no longer calm. Su Qing leaned against the stairs and looked at her. Are you afraid? Yi Liangqiu's gaze slowly moved to her face. Su Qing chuckled. See? This family has never been that simple. The next one to be dragged away might be you, or it might be me. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were cold. Aren't you sad? Why should I be sad? You are her biological daughter. To me, everything else is just a tool. There was nothing to feel sorry about. But no one will protect me in the future. Sister Liangqiu, I'm so scared. Yi Liangqiu's gaze stared straight into her eyes, not making a sound. Do you feel how scary Su Shurching is? Su Qing chuckled softly. He can even lay his hands on his wife. Think about how cold-hearted he is. Do you want us to join hands? And then? Yi Liangqiu looked at her. You'll kill me. How can I bear to do that? Su Qing restrained her expression. Isn't that too lonely? With that, she walked upstairs slowly and said, if you don't want to work together, Sister Liangqiu, then let's hurt each other. Yi Liangqiu looked at her back without saying a word. When he looked at the entrance of the villa again, the car had already left. She walked out slowly. Her white pajamas were very eye-catching under the white moonlight. Su Qing was right. No one in this family was innocent. If there was no trust between people, they would be smashed to pieces if they were not careful. Just like her mother. She had not seen Su Shiqing's true colors for so many years. Chapter 1455. Tonight had taught her a vivid lesson. She had never known that a person could be more ruthless than a beast when they were ruthless. And she felt more and more that the person behind it was Su Shiqing. Only such a deranged person would do such a crazy thing. That night, Yi Liangqiu didn't sleep well. She didn't see Su Shiqing when it was time for breakfast the next morning. Su Qing said casually, "He's probably trying to play the role of a loving and grieving husband to win the sympathy of the public. Don't wait. Have breakfast first." Yi Liangqiu looked up at Su Qing. "Don't you care?" Su Qing smiled a little sweetly. "Should I say something?" Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. After breakfast, she took a car to the company. As soon as she arrived at the company, her assistant, Xiao Wen, came up to her and whispered, "Mr. Yi, the president wants you to go to the office." Yi Liangqiu looked at her and said after a long time, "Got it." She walked to Su Shiqing's office and knocked on the door. After getting permission, she pushed the door open and went in. Su Shiqing pushed open the door and entered. He was smoking behind his desk. When he saw Yi Liangqiu enter, he placed a stack of documents on the table. "Take these and have a look. Find a chance to get in touch with Qin Anlin." Yi Liangqiu took a look. It was some cooperation between King Entertainment and ATV. Some of the details hadn't been settled yet. She nodded. "Okay, I will. Liangqiu, I trust you very much." Su Shiqing suddenly opened the drawer, took out a copy of the document and handed it to her. "Everything that Dad has is yours from now on. Don't let Dad down." She took it, but when she saw the line at the top, her fingers trembled. Su Shiqing looked at her and said sternly, "Liangqiu, you can't be bothered by small things when you want to do big things. Emotions should be abandoned. What about me?" She looked into his eyes fearlessly. "Will Dad treat me like this one day?" Su Shiqing didn't look away. He looked at her calmly. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Of course not." The documents in her hands fell onto the desk, scattered and messed up. Su Shiqing watched for a long time before saying softly, "Liangqiu, you can no longer turn back. Be good and pick it up." His tone was filled with love because she was his biological daughter. Not only was she not like Suya, but she was more like Hongku, so he especially loved her. Yi Liangqiu's voice was choked with sobs. "If I don't listen, does that mean I'll be destroyed?" This time, Su Shiqing's voice was resolute and decisive. "You are my only daughter. Of course, I will not destroy you, but I will destroy the thing that you care about the most." At this moment, she suddenly understood. Her return to the Su family had always been a trap. Once she walked in, it was destined that it would be difficult for her to get out. Unless she can destroy Su Shiqing, an opponent so strong that she was afraid of him, a person she should have respected. When she went out, her legs were weak. She had never suffered such a blow before. All her imagination of kinship turned into bubbles at this moment. Rather than saying that her mother was destroyed by Su Shiqing, it would be better to say that her return destroyed her mother. She looked down, and there were traces of tears on her eyelashes. She admitted that she was weak at this moment. She even regretted it a little. When that person was awake, she didn't call her mother. She didn't humble herself, oh. Chapter 1456. Su Shiqing's love for his family was a double-edged sword, which would hurt all the people around her, including Anlin and Mu Yun, and the child in her belly. At this time, she realized how sincere Su Shirching was, how stupid she was, and how angry Anlin was when she returned to the Su family. She used to think that she was going to be a savior, but it turned out to be a joke. She looked up and closed her eyes. Her eyes were full of tears. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and looked at Su Qing, who was not far away. Su Qing leaned against the wall and looked a little lazy. "Are you hurt?" She sighed. "Cry if you want. I allow you to cry on my shoulder." Yi Liangqiu stared at her. She felt that Su Qing was really shameless. "You don't want to. Are you embarrassed?" Su Qing chuckled and came over to hug her. "Do you feel better if I hug you like this?" Yi Liangqiu didn't move her body. She just gritted her teeth. "Su Qing, has anyone told you that you are a pervert?" Su Qing chuckled and then stepped back. "I have never been a pervert to anyone." Yi Liangqiu pushed her away and walked towards the elevator. "Hey! You really don't want to consider my proposal? You will cry in the future." There was a smile in Su Chang's eyes. Slowly, the smile disappeared. She was not indifferent. She didn't expect Su Shirching to be so cruel. Now she had no protection. She had to rely on herself. Yi Liangqiu went to her office. Her back was against the door. Her back was cold, and her body was soft. After a long time, she reached out and dialed a number. "Find someone to monitor Su Shirching for me." After work that day, she called Qin Anlin and said in a dry voice, "I want to see Mu Yun." Qin Anlin was in a meeting. After receiving the call, he motioned for the people below to be silent. Then, he held his phone and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the building not far away. "ATV. Do you want to see me or Mu Yun?" His voice was low and deep, but the senior management of King Entertainment trembled. They were shocked. The CEO was blatantly flirting with her. Yi Liangqiu sat in the car, her fingers stroking the seatbelt, and she lowered her eyes. "I said I wanted to see Mu Yun." Qin Anlin asked, "Where are you?" Before she could speak, he said, "I'll send someone to pick you up. Downstairs of the ATV." "I'll go there myself." She said softly, "Can you bring Mu Yun to the apartment?" Because she really did not have the face to see his mother. Qin Anlin's tone was a little mocking. "Feeling guilty?" "Qin Anlin, I don't want to argue with you." She was a little angry from embarrassment. But his heart softened. She missed her son. At least she still had some conscience. He guessed that even she missed him a little. But the words that came out of his mouth were not so pleasant to hear. It was even immoral. "What, you didn't have enough that night? You still want to come?" The senior management of King Entertainment couldn't take it anymore. There was no way to continue the meeting. So they all looked at Kaim. Kaim also expressed helplessness and coughed lightly. Meeting adjourned. But no one left. They all said that President Qin's phone call was much more interesting than the meeting. So they didn't leave one by one, secretly eavesdropping. When Qin Anlin hung up the phone and turned around, he saw them all pricking up their ears. He paused and looked at them. "Is King Entertainment doing well now? You still have time to gossip?" Chapter 1457. After he left, the scene fell into silence. Someone blurted out, "Boss Qin, are you offering your hot face to someone else's cold butt?" The atmosphere suddenly became lively, and Kaim couldn't help but say, "That's probably possible. Otherwise, President Qin wouldn't be so enthusiastic." After saying that, there was another burst of laughter. However, Kaim was a little worried. After all these years, he didn't worry about Yi Liangqiu's feelings for President Qin at all, but between them, there was the Su family. Would Mr. Yi give up on President Qin for ATV? It was hard to say. Qin Anlin went straight back to the apartment and then called Yi Liangqiu. I've picked up our son. Come here. His voice was a little cold, and there was even some kind of forbidden jade in it, so no one would doubt it at all. Yi Liangqiu didn't doubt it either. Her car was already parked downstairs. When she went up, she remembered that she still had the key, so she lowered her head. In the end, she didn't open the door, but chose to press the doorbell. The door opened, and Qin Anlin stood at the door expressionlessly. Where's Mu Yun? She asked softly, looking inside. His voice became even more indifferent. Mu Yun is with my mom. She was a little angry, and she glared at him. Qin Anlin, you're shameless. How am I shameless? His gaze became even colder. You throw him away whenever you want, and you see him whenever you want. Yi Liangqiu, is that what you think? She stepped on his foot angrily, but he easily dodged it. I haven't gotten rid of this habit. As he said that, he pressed her down and dragged her into the house. Before she could speak, she was kissed. She wanted to slap him angrily, but he caught her easily. Her hands were behind her, and he pressed gently, and she straightened up as if she was sending herself into his mouth. Embarrassed and angry, she wiped her lips after the kiss and glared at him. Shameless. Didn't you miss me? If you didn't miss me, why did you come to find me? He still held her in his arms, not letting her move. She wanted to deny it, but his lips were right behind her ear, her most sensitive spot. She murmured, Are you unhappy? Do you know what happens when you're unhappy? You really want someone to hug you. Her body trembled, and she turned her face away awkwardly. I didn't. You know better. He chuckled, grabbed her hand and walked inside. Sit on the sofa and rest. I'll cook. He took off his coat and walked into the kitchen. I will go. She sat there, but made no attempt to leave at once. Qin Anlin stood at the entrance of the kitchen and smiled. If you want to have sex, maybe not for the time being. I just had it a few days ago. Liangqiu, don't forget that you're pregnant. You have to control yourself. She couldn't bear listening to him anymore. Her face turned red. I didn't. That's good. He continued to chuckle. Relax when you're back. Oh. You don't know how you looked just now, but you looked like someone owed you $3 million. She couldn't help but caress her face. Did I? Confess. He chuckled, but he kept his expression when he turned around. Liangqiu, perhaps you don't know that I let you go back to the Su family because it's a relatively safe place for you. If you're by my side, I'll feel restrained instead. Chapter 1458. She glared at him angrily. But all she could do was sit there and watch him walk into the kitchen, his hands and feet especially nimble. If you're bored, you can watch some TV, he said lightly. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. His expression was very calm, as if the rift between them did not exist. She asked softly, Why? He lowered his head and said in a low voice while cutting vegetables, Didn't you come back because you were unhappy there? She did not say anything and sat quietly. Then, she hugged her body and looked out the window. How nice it would be if nothing had happened. How nice it would be if she was just Wang Ziyun's child. Everything about the Su family, the power and wealth of ATV had no attraction to her, but she was already involved and could not get away. There was a rhythmic sound of cutting vegetables coming from the kitchen. His side profile was calm and unperturbed, as if it was a tranquilizer. Her heart calmed down a lot. She walked slowly to the kitchen door and leaned against the door to look at him. Qin Anlin, why are you so indifferent? You want me to kneel down and beg you not to go? He continued to cut vegetables. Even if he was doing housework, he was still elegant and good-looking. Yi Liangqiu was speechless for a long time. After a long time, he smiled. If I can't stop you, then I won't. Her eyes were a little hot and she wanted to cry. He really knew her. There's smoke in the kitchen, it's not good for the child. Wait outside. He turned his body and looked at her indifferently. He looked like a gentleman, completely different from the day in the hotel. She was a little confused. 7:00 at night. The penthouse with 4 floor-to-ceiling windows and a luxurious dining table with 4 dishes and a soup. It was light and nutritious, suitable for pregnant women. Eat more, I'm afraid it will be hard for you to digest when you go back to the Su family. He said sarcastically as he gently placed the dishes for her. Yi Liangqiu just looked at him indifferently and started to eat. She did not have a good appetite in the early stages of pregnancy, so after a few mouthfuls, she covered her mouth and ran to the bathroom. Qin Anlin was startled and immediately put down his chopsticks and followed her. Lying there, she vomited so much that she almost threw up her bile. Her face turned green. He handed her a tissue to wipe it clean. Later, seeing that she had no strength, he picked her up and wiped her lips clean for her. He carefully wiped it. Although she was in a pathetic state and they were in such a situation, his heart still softened. Was it like this when you were pregnant with Mu Yun? His voice was incredibly gentle as he looked down at her pale face. Yi Liangqiu tried hard to look indifferent, but the redness on her ears betrayed her. After a long time, he said, "It's much more serious than that." He thought about how she had only left the entertainment industry after being pregnant for 4 months. How had she endured those days? His fingers gently rubbed her red ears, and he felt a little sad in his heart. Liangqiu, do you still want to pretend to be heartless? In the end, she still couldn't eat, so he cooked a glass of pear sugar for her. As he drank the sweet soup, his stomach seemed to have calmed down. Qin Anlin only ate a little and cleared the dishes. Walking to the living room, she sat in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights were not turned on, so it was dim. Chapter 1459. It's not that. He smiled. I'm entertaining the mother of my child. I'm afraid that your negative emotions will infect her. She leaned against the back of the sofa and rubbed her face gently, like a cat squinting. There was Qin Anlin's scent on it, which she missed. And he stood there, watching her blend into his house, just as she had done the first time she had been there. She looked at the night outside and finally said, Qin Anlin, she was driven crazy by Su Shiqing. Qin Anlin's body tensed up, and his voice was a little hoarse. Do you still want to go back? She nodded and then shook her head. I have to go back. He didn't ask her why. He just walked to the bar and poured himself a glass of wine. After drinking a small glass, he remembered something. I won't stop you. But Liangqiu, don't be merciful to me, because I won't. He looked at her and said word by word, don't let Su Shiqing down, because he wanted her to be well. Since she was by Su Shiqing's side, she had Su Shiqing's trust. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. She looked at him and couldn't believe what she had heard. Liangqiu, come back. His eyes were clear in the dark night. Because I'm waiting for you here. They would be enemies, but they were still the closest people. She looked at him in a daze. Qin Anlin smiled back, put down the glass in his hand, and slowly walked over to hug her gently on his shoulder. He put his face on the side of her neck. Our Liangqiu has always been very brave. Don't look back, don't worry about me. Protect yourself. Her throat felt as if it was blocked, and she couldn't say a word. Surrounded by his warm breath, she didn't want to leave. She didn't want to leave him. Anlin. She gently moved away from his embrace. I have to go. Otherwise, Su Shiqing will be suspicious. He didn't say anything for a long time. She slowly looked up at him. Qin Anlan's fingers gently touched her lips, and after a long time, he said softly, "Go." But she didn't move. She just looked up at him helplessly. Suddenly, his lips replaced his hands as he gently sucked on her lips and murmured, "If you don't leave now, I might not let you go." She wanted to struggle, but her fingers were locked by him. Just like that, he kissed her gently for a long time before he finally released her. Are you feeling better now? Do you have more courage? He hugged her gently. Liangqiu, it's not your fault. It's the result of human greed. She was so stupid that she would definitely think that it was her fault. She trembled slightly in his arms. After a long time, she asked in a trembling voice, "Is it true?" "Yes," he said, patting her on the back. "You never did her any harm, did you?" But she saw her mother go to that kind of place with her own eyes, and there was nothing she could do. She didn't love Mrs. Su, but she was still her mother. Anlan, will I become someone like Su Shiqing one day? She closed her eyes. I don't want that. Oh. He held her face and looked at her seriously. No, because you have me. So you will never become that kind of person. How can someone who has love become so terrible? She looked up at him, and then slowly moved away. Her voice was calm. I'll go back first. He walked her downstairs, opened the car door for her, and watched her start the car. The car slowly drove away, and he stood in the night wind for a full half an hour. Chapter 1460. When Yi Liangqiu returned to the Su mansion, she saw Su Qing sitting on the sofa and looking at her. She pretended not to see it and walked upstairs. You don't even need to say hello when you live under the same roof. Su Qing curled her lips. By the way, Dad just asked where you were. I said you had gone to the hospital and haven't come back yet. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. Su Qing stood up and walked towards her. She squinted at her and chuckled. I suggest that if you meet Qin Anlan next time, you should be more discreet. After all, our dear dad is very suspicious. Looking at Yi Liangqiu's indifference, Su Qing narrowed her eyes. Do you know why your mother went crazy? Yi Liangqiu stared at her. She was raped. Raped in front of Su Shiqing. Su Cheng's eyes were fierce and her voice was hoarse. What a good husband, isn't he? As she spoke, she began to laugh in a strange manner. Her laughter was so loud that it sounded like a squeak. Yi Liangqiu, you didn't expect that the home you miss so much is such a place where monsters gather. Su Qing got closer to her. He knew that she didn't eat anything all day in the mental hospital. He just shouted, don't come, as Su Qing said. She laughed more unscrupulously. Guess what he would do to you if you dared to betray him? Will they also find someone to rape you and drive you crazy? Yi Liangqiu grabbed Su Qing and pressed her body against the stairs. Su Qing was much shorter than her, so she couldn't resist. Do you think this kind of thing can destroy me? Yi Liangqiu's eyes were cold. He is terrible, but you are no better than him. He raised you, and you are so cold-blooded. You don't deserve to be a human at all. As she spoke, she threw Su Qing down. Su Qing coughed violently and looked at Yi Liangqiu, who was slowly going upstairs. Her voice was a little flustered and exasperated. If you don't join hands with me, then just wait for death. Yi Liangqiu left without looking back. However, she did not return to her bedroom. Instead, she went to the study. Su Qing was crazy, but what she said was true. She was like living under Su Shiqing's eyelids, unable to hide anything from him. Sometimes, it was better to be honest than to lie. When she opened the door, Su Shiqing was sitting behind the desk smoking. When he saw her, he immediately put out the cigarette and turned to open the window. After a while, she went straight in and sat on the sofa. "Dad, I want to see her." Su Shiqing looked at her and changed the topic. "Where did you go last night?" Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "I miss Mu Yun, so I went to see Qin Anlin." "Did you see him?" Su Shiqing was quite persistent. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "Qin Anlin didn't bring him back." Su Shiqing nodded and leaned back. "So you spent 2 hours with Qin Anlin. What did he say?" His tone was very easygoing, but she felt like a mountain was pressing down on her. She did not hesitate. "He didn't say anything. We had a meal together. He wants me to come back to him." "Oh." Su Shiqing was quite friendly. "If you like him, then continue to be together." Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "He asked me to leave the Su family." Su Shiqing smiled. "I don't care about it anymore." "What else does he care about?" After thinking for a while, he suddenly sighed. "Then Honka must care about it." "Yes, how could she agree to let my daughter marry into the Qin family? She must want you to break up with me." Chapter 1461. She looked at Su Shiqing and said after a long while, "Dad, I won't." Su Shiqing's gaze fell on her face. After a long while, he smiled and said, "Dad knows you won't." After a pause, he continued, "You are Su Shiqing's daughter. Naturally, you won't bow down to anyone." Yi Liangqiu looked down and said, "I know." She looked up at Su Shiqing again and said, "I want to see my mother." Su Shiqing's fingers on the desk trembled. He looked at Yi Liangqiu and said in a low voice, "Why? She doesn't treat you well. But she's still my mother in the end." Yi Liangqiu didn't avoid his eyes. "No matter what, I have to see her and know that she's still alive. Do you blame me?" Su Shiqing held the cigarette between his fingers but didn't light it. He just played with it gently. Yi Liangqiu didn't say anything. "Blame me for being too ruthless." Su Shiqing's voice was low. "Because your mother touched my bottom line." She walked forward and looked down at him. "But you shouldn't have done it in that way." Su Shiqing's fingers trembled again and his gaze sharpened. He looked at her and narrowed his eyes. "Who told you that?" She didn't say anything. Su Shiqing's gaze deepened and he said 2 words, "Su Qing." Yi Liangqiu didn't deny it. "I underestimated her." Su Shiqing looked at her and said, "Liangqiu, not only do you have to work with King Entertainment, but you also have to destroy Su Qing." She looked calm and asked, "Why?" "Because she shouldn't be in this house." Su Shiqing's voice didn't have a trace of warmth. "Because she'll be in your way." When she went out, her legs were a little weak, and Su Cheng was leaning against the door of her room, looking at her. When she walked closer, Su Cheng looked at her and said, "He wants you to deal with me, right?" Yi Liangqiu laughed coldly and said, "You two really know each other." Then she walked into her bedroom. After taking a shower, she lay down, but she couldn't fall asleep. She took out her phone and looked at Mu Yun's photos. As she scrolled through them, she turned to Qin Anlin's. His fingers paused and gently stroked the surface. That photo was taken many years ago, when she was still his sleeping pill on his pillow. Early that morning, he had hugged her from behind and they were only wearing bathrobes. After so many years, the photo frame was still there. He had always placed it at the head of the bed. This also made him shamelessly say to Mu Yun, "Look, you are the crystallization of Daddy and Mommy's love." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and caressed it with her fingers. The next morning, after breakfast, Su Shiqing knocked on the table and said calmly, "If you want to see it, go ahead." She looked up in surprise, but Su Shiqing had already left. Only Su Qing and Yi Liangqiu were left in the dining room. Su Qing laughed coldly and said, "It seems that he is really a loving father to you. He actually allowed you to see him. Oh." Yi Liangqiu looked at Su Qing and drank the last glass of milk. "You should worry about yourself." Now, she actually felt a little sympathetic for Su Qing. She remembered that when she first met Su Qing, she was like a little princess, living a carefree life. She ran downstairs and called out to Anlan Gu. Su Cheng's expression changed slightly and her voice became gloomy. "Don't look at me with sympathy." She gritted her teeth and said, "I don't deserve your sympathy." Chapter 1462. Su Qing narrowed her eyes. "Of course. But you look so pitiful to me." Yi Liangqiu chuckled. "You probably don't know what you want after living for so long, do you?" She stood up, her face expressionless. "You betrayed your family, betrayed your foster mother. Su Qing, what do you have left? What else do you care about in this world? What's the difference between being alive and being a zombie?" Su Cheng's expression changed drastically at that moment. She sneered, "How would you know if I have perseverance in my heart?" With that, she smiled sweetly again. "Does Dad know that you are so sentimental? He wants you to be as emotionless as he is, like a block of wood." Yi Liangqiu looked at Su Qing coldly. "I'll let you know my emotionless side." Su Qing tilted her head and chuckled. "I'm so scared." Yi Liangqiu ignored her and went straight to the car. She was about to start the car when the door to the front passenger seat was opened. Su Qing sat down beside her. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and started the car. It didn't matter if she followed or not. The car drove to the mental hospital. Walking along the alley that was covered with green vines, Yi Liangqiu's gaze was a little gloomy. She looked at Su Qing and paused. "This is where Wang Kaiyun left in the past." Su Qing did not say anything. "She's your mother." Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. "Until her death, she never felt that she was wrong. She used to visit you often." Mrs. Su and Wang Kaiyun had given all their love to Su Qing, but Su Qing was never touched at all. She only snorted and said, she deserved it. No one knew that she would rather not have been sent away. She would rather live as the Yi family. Yi Liangqiu did not say anything. She met the doctor and asked about Mrs. Su's condition. The doctor shook his head. "The situation is very bad. The patient was too traumatized, and the medicine was not important to her at all. Because she was willing to sink into that dark memory, no one could pull her out." Yi Liangqiu nodded lightly. "Take good care of her." "Do you want to meet him?" the doctor asked. "But we have to pass through the barbed wire. The patient is now self-harming, and we can't rule out the possibility of injuring someone." Yi Liangqiu didn't refuse. Because she was pregnant, she wasn't going to risk the baby. Through the barbed wire fence, she saw Mrs. Su. It had only been 2 days, but Mrs. Su was no longer the person she knew. She had lost at least 5 pounds, and her eyes were sunken. Not to mention, her entire face was yellow as if it had been sucked dry by something. Yi Liangqiu's heart clenched, and she felt an indescribable pain. This is how the world is. Only the strong can survive. The weak will fall like her. Su Cheng's voice rang out softly beside her. After a long time, Yi Liangqiu said, "Isn't it enough? Isn't it enough to have so much?" They were a couple who had lived together for decades, but she didn't even give them a chance to live. Su Qing was wrong. She and Su Shiqing were not related by blood, but strangers. It was just that he felt a little more secure than ordinary people. Yi Liangqiu couldn't bear to watch anymore, so she turned around. At this moment, she heard a murmur behind her, Su Su. Su Su. Mama is here, Su Su. Yi Liangqiu raised her head, and her eyes were hot. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.